Hello everyone, this is a very boring video about using sources. It's important though. It's one of the things that I will admit at times I don't teach quite as fully as I ought to, simply because I think it's so enormously dry and I really hate it. And I also think it's best learned by absorbing material through reading. So, with that in mind, as you read sources, pay attention to how they use sources because we're not going to cover everything today. This is just going to be a few things, but these few things will get you pretty far. So, let's take a look at various ways to use sources. So, everything that I'm doing today comes, by the way, from the MLA sample paper produced by the Purdue OWL. It is exceptionally boring, um, but it's immaculate in terms of its use of sources and in terms of its formatting because it's there to teach you about MLA format. I'll include a link to that in the description of this video. Let's look at this. John Lorraine begins his first chapter by stating that very erroneous theories have been propagated, resulting in faulty farming methods. I'm on the edge of my seat. So you'll notice a couple of things here. First of all, the in-text citation, which is the portion of the citation that lets us know that the information that we're talking about comes from a source. It doesn't have the author's last name in it. It's just the page number inside of these parentheses at the end of the sentence with the punctuation on the outside. So it's inside of these parentheses, just one, that page number. That page number 1 doesn't need the author's last name because the first part of the sentence has the author in it. John Lorraine begins. And it would be redundant to put it there again. So for simplicity's sake, it's removed. But what I really want to look at here is not just that citation and its formatting, but the way this source is used. It's couched within a sentence. So this author has a sentence, John Lorraine begins his first chapter by stating that, and then you've got a piece of the sentence there. So, and two, look at this. The bracketed V right there, that lowercase bracketed V, that's because even though this is within quotation marks, showing that it comes directly from another source, this bracketed V is to let you know that the capitalization has been changed or something about it has been changed. Whenever you're altering something about a quote or you're adding a word or changing a letter, you place that in brackets to let the reader know this is a change that that you made, not that was present in the original quote. My guess is that this probably started a sentence in the original source, very erroneous theories have been propagated, blah, 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 that here is in the middle of a sentence and therefore doesn't need the capital V. Great. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so we've got a couple of sources here. One, we've got farmers who wanted print information about agriculture, had their choice of agricultural almanacs and even local newspapers to receive information. Open parentheses, author's last name, Dan Hoff, page number 54, close parenthesis, punctuation. This is the most standard in-text citation when you use information from a source, whether you quote it, paraphrase it, put it in your own words. If it's just any idea that's not common knowledge that you use from a source, you have to have an in-text citation. Here, it's the basic kind with the author's last name and the page number fully. If you look down here, though, we've got more information. This blue underlined section from 1820 to 1870, agricultural periodicals were responsible for spreading new knowledge among farmers. That is certainly not common knowledge, right? It's because who knows anything about agricultural periodicals and their function from 1820 to 1870. So that's not common knowledge. It is a claim that's being made, but it doesn't have a citation after it. That's because this green section in his published dissertation, The American Agricultural Press, 1819 to 1860, Albert Lowther de Marie presents a description of the general content of agricultural journals. That was probably something like them. And then we have the page number. It comes from the preface XI, 11 for the Roman numerals, and then the period, right? So this is the beginning of a longer discussion that includes facts from this dissertation that support that claim in blue. So green supports blue. So you don't have to have, after every single sentence that uses information from a source, you don't have to have a citation after every sentence. It has to be understandable, though, which information is from your own head, from your own knowledge, or what you're saying is common, and which information comes from a source. So it's entirely possible to have one sentence after another where the citation comes in the second sentence and it applies to the former sentence as well. And that relationship is pretty clear when we look at these two sentences side by side. Very, very cool stuff. Anything we need to talk about there beyond that? Nope. Okay. Oftentimes you'll find yourself in your paper having to move back and forth between different sources, or I should say, if you're doing it correctly, you'll have to move back and forth between different sources. That's what you want to do. It's part of your task as the author of this paper and as someone who also wrote an annotated bibliography, to gather sources from various places and then to place them in conversation with one another. What that means is that you've got different sets of information and you've got one idea you're communicating with that information. And so you're kind of weaving together different sources. You're taking a little bit of Danhoff and a little bit of Hurt and you're sort of mixing them together to make a new point. When you do that, that's great. Then you in combining things, you're making something new. However, that can make it complicated within one paragraph when you have to make sure that you're strictly talking about or strictly citing in your in-text citation the source that you're using. So that means that oftentimes you'll have to switch back and forth. So here we do have this Danhoff 7 citation and the first red underline. Following that, though, we have a sentence, here's a claim, trade and transportation thus begin to influence farming life significantly. Okay, that's a conclusory statement because of the information we have from Danhoff, and this is the information we get from the word thus. Because of information from Danhoff, we can say that trade and transportation began to influence farming life significantly. And now we have a new sentence, before 1820, the rural community accounted for 80% of consumption of farmers' goods. That sentence is a clear just statement of fact, right? And so we need a new citation there. However, it doesn't come from Danhoff. It comes from Hurt. So we need another in-text citation, and there it is. The next section, though, the next sentence, uses quotes again from Hurt, but on a different page, and we have another in-text citation. We've left out, however, the author's last name. We don't need Hurt anymore, because when we have multiple citations from the same source within one paragraph in a row, and those are all sort of boxes you have to tick, then you don't have to include the author's last name again. It just gets kind of redundant. So, because all this information is coming from Hurt, after we've cited Hurt 127 the first time, the next time we just do 128. And that will be true for the rest of the paragraph as long as we're only citing from Hurt. If we switch from Hurt to Danhoff, then we have to include Danhoff's last name. And if we switch back to Hurt, we've got to use Hurt's last name again as well. All right. Let's look at this whole paragraph. We're just going to read the whole thing and then talk about its use of a source. In his 1825 book, Nature and Reason Harmonized in the Practice of Husbandry, John Lorraine begins his first chapter by stating that very erroneous theories have been propagated, resulting in faulty farming methods. His words here create a framework for the rest of his book, as he offers his readers narratives of his own trials and errors, and even dismisses foreign, time-tested techniques farmers had held on to. The knowledge we have of that very ancient and numerous nation, the Chinese, as well as the very located habits and costumes of this very singular people, is in itself insufficient to teach us. His book captures the call and need for scientific experimentation to develop new knowledge meant to be used in, on, with American soil, which reflects some farmers' thinking of the day. All right, this whole paragraph is about this one book, right? Nature and Reason Harmonized in the Practice of Husbandry. The following paragraph is likely going to be some sort of analysis or application of this material to some larger picture, right? But we don't need an in-text citation at the very end because we're obviously talking about his book and using information from his book. This is kind of, I have this screenshot tagged as use your head, but that's really the core method here, is that if you have a whole paragraph that's about one topic and you've started by saying this paragraph is about this source by this person, then that's sufficient, right? You have clearly indicated that this information is going to come from that person and that source. That said, if you're doing that, you have to be very careful not to include your own opinions or your own sort of perspectives or thoughts about things. You're just presenting information from that source in that paragraph. All right. Last, let's look at a sample of the Works Cited page just to point a few things out. This is not the entire Works Cited page, but it's part of it, and it looks pretty nice. We'll note that Works Cited is centered, W and C are capitalized in the middle up there. The sources are listed by author last name, and they all have very neat, orderly hanging indents. If you're concerned about the production of a Works Cited page, I would encourage you to look at the Works Cited page in the linked sample from the Purdue OWL. It's got all kinds of helpful information in there, and that is what I go back to, the Purdue OWL, when I'm trying to figure out how to do citations for anything for me. But this looks pretty nice, and yours should look something like this when you are done with it. Okay, in review, one way to use a source is to couch it within your own sentence. This is a great way to use a source, probably my favorite. When you do use sources, you're trying to put them in conversation with one another. And when you do that, you've got to switch back and forth with your citations. It looks ugly, but that's because MLA is basically the worst citation style. We just have to use it because we're in English. If you have multiple citations from one source within a paragraph, feel free to start dropping the author's last name and just to include the page number, as long as it's clear that it's coming from the same source. And if you have a summative paragraph about a single source, use your head about when to include citations, as long as it's within that one paragraph and it's only that one source. Finally, your Works Cited page should look like that. All right, thanks.